Raymond Morris, a stoic 71-year-old Marine veteran, is turned away from a crowded shelter on a snowy night, his rusted dog tag his only proof of service. Emily, a volunteer, records the quiet injustice and contacts a Marine saved by Ray in Fallujah. By sunrise, 12 Marines stand in silent tribute outside the shelter, placing Ray's dog tag on the steps. The moment goes viral, exposing the neglect of veterans. Ray, now seen, finds a quiet room and purpose, speaking to recruits. But who else remains invisible? The story begs, will you notice the silent heroes among us? Support our channel to keep stories like Ray's alive. Subscribe, share, and join us in honoring veterans' silent struggles. Your support amplifies their voices, ensuring no hero is forgotten. Visit our page, engage with our content, and help us build a community that sees and remembers. Thank you. The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets as he appeared just past midnight, a lone figure emerging from the darkness. His coat, threadbare and faded, hung loosely over his gaunt frame, the same one he'd worn for years. His limp was unmistakable, a slow, uneven cadence that spoke of old wounds never fully healed. He didn't speak, didn't demand attention, just stood quietly before the shelter's glass door, where a sign declared in stark letters, "Shelter full." The guard, bundled against the cold, barely glanced up from his post. "Keep moving," he said, voice flat, eyes already drifting back to the warmth of the building. "No room tonight." The old man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached beneath his collar with a trembling hand, pulling free a rusted dog tag that glinted faintly under the streetlight. He held it up, not as a plea, but as a quiet testament. "I've slept in worse for this country," his gesture seemed to say. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the swirling snow. By dawn, the shelter's entrance was no longer empty. 12 Marines stood in formation, their dress blues crisp against the gray morning, boots aligned with precision, faces carved from stone. One stepped forward, his breath visible in the frigid air, and placed the dog tag on the concrete. The name etched into the metal read, Raymond Morris. It was a name that carried weight, though few in the shelter would have known it. Raymond Morris, at 71, was not a man who commanded attention. He didn't stride into rooms with a puffed chest or a need for recognition. His presence was quiet, unassuming, like a shadow that moved without disturbing the light. But to those who looked closely, there was something undeniable in his bearing, a rhythm to his uneven gait that hinted at discipline forged in fire. His eyes, lined with the weight of decades, never stopped moving, scanning every alley, every doorway, every potential threat. His silence wasn't fragility. It was a vault, heavy with memories of names, places, and moments that clung to him like ghosts. Vietnam's jungles, where the air was thick with heat and danger, had claimed 2 tours of his youth. The deserts of the Middle East, where the sun burned hotter than any hell he'd known, took another. He never spoke of the specifics, but fragments slipped out in rare moments of unguarded speech. "Fallujah was a furnace," he'd mutter, or "the jungle never lets you sleep." Those words weren't for show, just truths dropped like stones into a still pond, rippling briefly before sinking out of sight. Raymond, or Rai as those closest to him once called him, had earned his stripes through blood and sacrifice. Shrapnel had torn into his leg near Da Nang, a jagged price paid to drag 2 pinned down Marines to safety. In Ramadi, he'd hauled a brother in arms from a burning Humvee, the flames licking at his own skin as he refused to let go. Twice he'd waved off medevacs, choosing to stay in the fight. He'd slept in mud so thick it clung like despair, marched through heat that blurred the horizon, and stood watching cold that seeped into his bones. Medals, they were nothing to him. Not because he hadn't earned them, his chest could have carried a constellation of honors, but because he believed the true measure of a man lay not in what was pinned to his uniform, but in what he carried inside. The weight of his soul was heavy with duty, with loss, with the names of those who never made it back. Life after the service hadn't been kind. Linda, his wife, was his anchor, her laughter a balm for the chaos he'd brought home. But cancer stole her while he was still learning to navigate a world that no longer made sense. Her death left a void, a quiet ache that settled into his bones alongside the shrapnel. His son drifted away, first in spirit, then in distance, until the space between them grew louder than any words they'd ever shared. Rai didn't speak of it, but the pain was there, etched into the lines of his face, a silent grief he carried without complaint. PTSD wasn't the dramatic kind seen in movies. No shouting, no cinematic flashbacks. It was subtler, crueler, a tension that never eased, a sleep that never deepened, a need to always face the door. He couldn't stand anyone walking too close behind him, a habit born of survival, not paranoia. Employers didn't understand the way his eyes darted to exits or the way he flinched at sudden sounds. Friends, once plenty, stopped calling. The walls of his home, once lined with family photos and a proudly displayed American flag, were sold to pay bills that piled up like debts he couldn't outrun. Yet even as the world stripped him bare, he never begged. He didn't stand on street corners with a cardboard sign, didn't ask for handouts. All he sought was what he called a quiet roof, a place to lay his head, to feel human for a few hours. He'd arrive at shelters near midnight, never early, never loud. If there was space, he'd offer a nod of gratitude and be gone before dawn. If there wasn't, he'd move on without protest, his worn boots carrying him into the night. Beneath his faded coat, tucked against his chest, was the one thing he never parted with, a dog tag, old and rusted, etched with his name and blood type. It wasn't a trophy or a badge of pride. It was proof of who he was, even if the world had forgotten. Rai rarely spoke of his service unless pressed, and even then his words were sparse. Marine Corps, he'd say, a while back. The word hero made him bristle. That's for the ones who didn't come home, he'd say, his voice low, final. When asked why he didn't lean on the VA or chase veteran benefits, he'd shrug, a faint shadow crossing his face. Spent my life earning things, he said once. Wasn't about to start asking for them. To Rai, titles were meaningless. Veteran, sergeant, father. What mattered was action, not labels. And so that night at the shelter, no one recognized him. Not the guard, not the staff, not the others seeking refuge from the cold. Because Raymond Morris wasn't a man who made noise. He was a man who carried his story in silence. In the weight of a rusted dog tag, in the steady rhythm of a limp that told of battles fought and burdens borne. Ray Morris never bothered with introductions. He didn't see the point. His presence spoke for itself, carved into the lines of his weathered face and the slow, deliberate way he carried himself. Parkside Community Shelter crouched at the intersection of 9th and Franklin, a squat brick structure with heavy glass doors that groaned under their own weight. Inside, a single heater sputtered uselessly, its warmth barely reaching beyond the warped plywood counter. The shelter wasn't a place for comfort. It was a last resort, a temporary refuge for those who needed to vanish from the biting cold for a few hours. Most who shuffled through its doors weren't chasing hope. They just wanted to survive the night. It was just past midnight when Ray arrived, his boots crunching through the thick, wet snow that had begun to blanket the city. The storm had rolled in earlier than expected, and the flakes clung to his damp coat, melting into the fabric until it hung heavy on his shoulders. His boots were soaked through, the leather cracked and useless against the chill that seeped into his bones. Each step was measured, not out of caution, but from a body that carried too many memories. Memories of places and years that refused to fade. He didn't knock on the shelter's door. He never did. This wasn't his first time here, and the ritual was as familiar as the ache in his leg that had lingered since a dusty road in Fallujah in 1983. Inside, the shelter manager sat behind the plexiglass shield of the counter, her face half lit by the flicker of a fluorescent bulb. She didn't look up right away, her attention fixed on the clipboard in her hands, as if the scribbled names and numbers held the answers to the world's problems. When she finally raised her eyes, they narrowed, not with malice, but with the guarded suspicion of someone who'd seen too many stories walk through that door, most of them ending badly. Ray offered a small nod, a gesture that wasn't a plea or a question, just a quiet acknowledgement of their unspoken routine. I'm back. Got room? His expression stayed neutral, betraying none of the exhaustion that gnawed at him, none of the faint flicker of hope he barely admitted to himself. The manager's lips pressed into a thin line. She flipped through her papers, the rustle of them loud in the otherwise silent lobby. We're full, she said, her voice flat but final. Ray didn't flinch. He stood there, snow dripping from his coat onto the cracked linoleum floor, his breath steady despite the cold that clung to him. "I understand," he said softly, his voice rough but calm, like gravel smoothed by years of wear. "Was here 2 nights ago, slept by the boiler room, kept to myself, no trouble." His words weren't an argument, just a quiet reminder, a faint hope that the memory of his uneventful stay might sway her. She sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of too many nights like this. "That was 2 nights ago. We're full now." Her tone didn't invite debate, and Ray didn't push. He shifted his weight slightly, trying to ease the throbbing in his leg without drawing attention to it. The pain was an old companion, one he'd learned to live with, but it flared worse in the cold. "Any chance I could wait inside a bit?" he asked, his voice still even. "Just to dry off. I'll be gone before dawn." Her eyes hardened, the lines around them deepening. "No ID, no paperwork, no entry. This isn't a drop-in center. Without a referral, I can't help you." The words were rote, delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who'd said them too many times. Ray's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for much, just a dry corner." His voice held a quiet dignity, a plea wrapped in pride, but it wasn't enough. The manager reached for the phone without hesitation, her fingers moving with the efficiency of routine. Within moments, a uniformed guard appeared from the hallway, his boots clicking against the floor. He was young, barely out of his 20s, with a square jaw and clean-shaven face that still held the earnestness of someone new to the job. His boots gleamed under the dim lights, untouched by the slush outside. The manager didn't look up from her clipboard. "Escort him out," she said, her voice as cold as the wind howling beyond the doors. The guard pointed toward the street, his face blank, his silence louder than any words. Ray hesitated, not out of defiance, but from a fleeting moment of disbelief. How quickly a man could slip from invisible to unwanted. How easily the world could turn its back. His eyes swept the lobby, taking in the handful of people slumped on the benches. A woman clutched her backpack to her chest, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the floor as if looking up might make her complicit. A man leaned against the wall, his face half hidden by the collar of his coat, staring at nothing. No one met Ray's eyes. No one spoke. Silence was currency here, a shield against trouble, and Ray didn't blame them. He'd learned that lesson long ago. He turned toward the door, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. The cold hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, the snow falling thicker now, sticking to the ground in uneven patches. The street was empty, the city hushed under the weight of the storm. The wind cut through his coat, sharp and unforgiving, but Ray didn't flinch. He reached beneath his shirt, his fingers brushing the worn edges of the dog tag that hung against his chest. Just metal, just a name, just a tether to a life that felt like someone else's. He glanced back at the shelter, his eyes catching the sign taped to the door. Shelter full. It was small, unremarkable, but it carried the same sting as the signs he'd seen in another life. Enemy checkpoint, caution, mines, do not enter. This one hurt in a quieter way, but it hurt all the same. Ray started walking, his left boot dragging slightly, the way it always had since that day in Fallujah. The snow crunched under his feet, the sound swallowed by the wind. He had no plan, no destination, just the instinct to keep moving. For men like Ray Morris, forward was the only direction left, even when it led nowhere. Emily Cooper had been volunteering at Parkside Shelter for just under 4 months, a college senior with a schedule that left her weekends free and a heart that refused to stay idle. She wasn't official staff, just a pair of willing hands and a stubborn belief that small acts could matter. Her father, a retired Marine with 2 Purple Hearts and a box of medals he kept locked away, had raised her on stories of duty and sacrifice, though he never spoke of his own. His words echoed in her mind. If you're not lifting someone up, you're just taking up space. That belief had brought her here to a place where the air smelled of damp clothes and disinfectant, where hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed. That night, Emily was behind the intake desk, restocking supply kits. She stuffed gallon-sized Ziploc bags with socks, wet wipes, and hand warmers, her hands moving with the rhythm of routine. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary, and she found a quiet satisfaction in knowing that each bag might mean a moment of relief for someone's cold feet or chapped hands. She was labeling the last bag, her marker squeaking against the paper, when she heard voices near the door. At first, she didn't look up. Late arrivals were common, and she'd learned to tune out the low hum of conversations, most of them too heavy, too fleeting to linger on. But then she caught the tone of the manager's voice, clipped, final, like a door slamming shut. Emily's heart up, her eyes catching the man standing at the counter. He was older, his coat soaked through, his face etched with exhaustion and something deeper. Something that spoke of years spent carrying burdens no one else could see. His voice was low, steady, and there was a quiet dignity in the way he spoke, even as the manager's words closed the door on him. Emily's heart twisted as she listened, a mix of sympathy and frustration bubbling up inside her, and she wanted to say something, to offer a word of kindness, but she hesitated, her hands still clutching the bag she'd been labeling. She was just a volunteer, new to this world of hard rules and harder choices. What could she do? As the guard appeared and the man turned to leave, Emily's eyes lingered on him, her mind racing. She thought of her father's, of the way he'd spoken of men like this, soldiers who'd given everything and come home to a world that didn't always know how to give back. She wondered what this man carried, what stories lay hidden beneath his silence. But the moment passed and he was gone, swallowed by the storm outside. Emily stood frozen, the bag still in her hands, her heart heavy with the weight of what she could have done differently. Emily slipped into the shadowed corner of the hallway, her sneakers silent against the scuffed linoleum floor. Her heart thudded as she pressed herself against the cold wall, just out of sight, but close enough to catch the low murmur of voices at the front desk. She peered around the corner, her breath shallow, watching the man, tall, weathered, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone who'd carried too much for too long. His presence was quiet but commanding, his patience a hard-won thing, etched into the lines of his face. He didn't yell or beg, his words were few, each one heavy with purpose. But when he raised a battered dog tag in his hand, Emily felt a chill settle in her chest, a pang she couldn't name. Her fingers moved before her mind caught up, slipping into her coat to tap record on her phone. Not for likes or shares, not for some fleeting moment of drama, just a gut instinct to preserve the weight of what she was witnessing. The guard's cautious step forward, the man's subtle shift in stance, the quiet sting of rejection that lingered like a bruise. She saw it all, the stillness, the unspoken shame, and when he turned to leave, his footsteps echoed in the silence, leaving only the ghost of his presence. She stood frozen, her pulse loud in her ears. It wasn't indecision that held her there, but a simmering anger, deep and fierce, the kind she hadn't felt since she was a teenager, watching her father at a pharmacy counter, his voice calm but strained, and as he explained again why his VA prescription wasn't honored. The memory burned, raw and sharp, and it propelled her forward. She darted out the side exit, the night air slapping her face as she scanned the street. There he was, a lone figure at the block's edge, his walk uneven, his left leg dragging slightly, an old wound betraying him with every step. His coat was drenched, clinging to his frame, his shoulders hunched as if the wind might topple him. Emily's chest ached, pity, admiration, a tangle of emotions she couldn't sort. She called out, her voice soft but cutting through the quiet. "Sir, hold in a second." He paused, turning only halfway, his face half illuminated by the flicker of a street lamp. His eyes were wary, not hostile but worn, like he'd learned long ago not to trust kindness. Emily stepped closer, her hands unsteady as she extended a paper bag. "It's not much," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "Just some protein bars and a thermal pack. I packed extra tonight, thought someone might need it." He studied her, his gaze piercing, yet guarded, for a long moment. Then, with a faint nod, he accepted the bag, his fingers grazing the paper with a gentleness that caught her off guard. No words, just that nod, but it carried a quiet gratitude. "I'm Emily," she said, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "I volunteer inside." She wasn't sure why she added that, maybe to anchor herself in the moment. He met her eyes, and for the first time he spoke. "Ray." His voice was low, rough, like stones tumbling in a dry riverbed. Emily extended her hand, a small act that felt daring. "Ray, what?" she asked, half bracing for silence. He sighed, a heavy sound, and after a beat said, "Morris." The name struck a chord, though she didn't know why. "Morris," she echoed, her brow creasing. Then it hit her, a flicker of her uncle's old stories. "As in, were you ever with the 1st Marine Division?" A longer pause this time, and then a slight nod. "Long time ago," he murmured, the words distant, like they belonged to someone else. Emily's breath hitched. She didn't push further. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her fingers steady now as she scrolled to Uncle Mike. The line picked up instantly. "Mike Jensen," came the gruff reply. Emily turned slightly, cupping the phone against the wind. "It's me," she said, her voice resolute. "I need a favor. I just met someone. His name's Ray Morris." Silence hung on the other end, then 2 words clipped and urgent. "Where is he?" Before the sun rose, the streets outside Parkside Shelter lay hushed, cloaked in pre-dawn darkness. Frost clung to windshields, and a thin veil of snow dusted the sidewalks. Inside, the shelter hummed with routine, staff flipping through intake forms, pouring tepid coffee into paper cups, exchanging quiet words under harsh lights. No one noticed the first black SUV glide up, its tires whispering against the ice. Then another pulled in, followed by a third, each arriving with a silent precision that felt almost ceremonial. No lights, no sirens, just dark vehicles with military plates lining up outside, engines off, doors shut. For a moment, the world outside held its breath, the quiet thick with intent. Then the doors swung open. 12 men emerged, each in full-dress Marine uniform, their boots striking the ground as one. They were diverse, different ages, builds, skin tones, but united by the same disciplined poise, the same quiet resolve, as if bound by an unspoken oath. They formed a precise line before the shelter, boots aligned, hands at their sides, their faces stoic yet purposeful. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. A staffer glanced out the window and stilled, her cup frozen mid-sip. Another stepped back from the glass, unnerved. "What's going on?" someone muttered, but no one knew. The shelter manager, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, strode to the door, peering into the dim light. Her expression morphed, confusion, then worry, then a slow realization that this was no ordinary visit. This was a statement. One Marine stepped forward, his silvered temples glinting, his chest heavy with ribbons that spoke of battles fought and losses borne. His name tag read Jensen. He didn't knock or speak. Instead, he drew a rusted dog tag from his coat, the chain catching the faint light. With a slow grace, he crouched and placed it on the concrete step outside the door. A small act imbued with profound weight. He rose, his gaze briefly meeting the manager's through the glass. The dog tag rested there, a silent symbol of something unresolved, something sacred. The morning light caught the edge of the rusted dog tag, its faint glow piercing the frost that clung to the concrete. The name etched into the metal stood out in stark relief: Raymond Morris. Inside the shelter, the air was thick with a silence heavier than the winter cold outside. The manager's face went pale, his eyes flickering between the dog tag and the 12 Marines standing in rigid formation just beyond the glass doors. His hands shook, a quiet betrayal of the unease rolling inside him. He opened his mouth, searching for something to say, but the words dissolved before they could form. Behind him, a staff member reached for a phone, fingers hovering uncertainly. Should they call the police, a news outlet, or some higher authority who might know how to handle this? No one seemed to know. Outside, the Marines stood like statues, their breath forming soft clouds in the icy air, their faces carved with a resolve that needed no explanation. The street, usually alive with the chatter of morning routines, grew still. A man from the diner across the street, clutching a steaming coffee cup, started to wander over, curiosity pulling him forward. But when he saw the line of uniforms, he stopped short, the warmth of his drink forgotten as he stood rooted in place. A delivery driver, mid-route, eased his van to the curb, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. A man walking his dog slowed, then halted entirely, the leash dangling loosely as he stared, his dog tilting its head in quiet confusion. By 8 a.m., A small crowd had gathered, strangers drawn together by an unspoken pull. No one spoke. No one dared to break the reverence of the moment. A local reporter, alerted by a passerby who'd seen the black SUVs roll in, arrived with a camera slung over his shoulder. He started filming from across the street, capturing the stark contrast of the Marines' pristine uniforms against the weathered facade of the shelter. But as he adjusted his lens, a weight settled in his chest. This wasn't a moment for headlines or viral clips. It was something sacred, something that demanded silence over spectacle. He lowered his camera, stepping back, his breath catching as he realized he was witnessing a truth too profound for soundbites. After 20 minutes, the Marines moved as one, their boots striking the pavement in perfect unison as they turned and marched back to their vehicles. Doors opened, engines growled to life, and just as quickly as they'd arrived, they were gone. The dog tag remained untouched, its faint gleam a quiet testament on the cold ground. For days, no one dared to disturb it. It became a symbol, a marker of a man the world had forgotten. Inside the shelter, the staff scrambled for explanations. Someone muttered about a misunderstanding. Raymond hadn't followed protocol, hadn't shown proper ID, wasn't registered. But the excuses rang hollow, drowned out by the weight of the truth. Emily Cooper, the volunteer who'd first seen the quiet dignity in Raymond's tired eyes, had recorded the moment on her phone. She hadn't meant for it to spread, but someone, perhaps a resident, perhaps a bystander, had shared it. By week's end, millions had watched the video, 12 Marines standing in silent tribute to a man who'd been invisible until that moment. Raymond Morris, once a name lost to the edges of society, was now a beacon of something greater. The image hit the local news by noon, the dog tag's weathered edges stark against the snow. The Marines' shoulders squared in a line of unwavering respect. No caption was needed, no commentary required. A single word trended in the caption bar: honor. Veterans were the first to respond, their voices rising from the quiet corners of Facebook groups and message boards. Men and women who'd long buried their own stories began to share. Memories of cold nights, of doors closed in their faces, of the slow grinding loss of pride after serving a nation that seemed to turn away. One man, his profile picture, a faded snapshot of a younger self in uniform. Form typed, "That could have been me. Hell, it was me once." His words carried the weight of years, of battles fought not just on distant fields, but in the silent struggles of his own life. Comments flooded in, hundreds, then thousands. Some burned with anger, others ached with shame, but most were simply stunned. How had it come to this? How had it taken 12 uniforms to make the world see one man? By evening, the shelter's phone rang without pause. News outlets, radio stations, veteran organizations, even a congressman's office left voicemails, each grappling with the story's weight. The mayor issued a statement, carefully crafted, calling it a powerful moment that reminds us of our obligation to those who served. It was polished, vague, and said nothing new. But the public wasn't waiting for official words. They were already moving. That night, the shelter's doorstep became a shrine. Blankets, trays of food, and bags of clothing piled up, too many to count. Someone left a pair of brand new boots, a note tucked inside. For the one who never stopped but marching. By morning, a group of high school students arrived, their handmade signs bold with marker. "We stand with Ray. Shelters should welcome heroes." Their teacher, a Navy veteran with a quiet strength, stood behind them, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and pain. Inside the shelter, change came swiftly. Staff were told to overhaul intake procedures. A VA representative was brought in, though everyone knew it wasn't temporary. Policies were rewritten overnight, and security cameras were quietly unplugged. Some changes, though, couldn't be undone. Emily Cooper, the volunteer who'd first reached out to Raymond's uncle, was asked to take a leave. No reason was given, just a vague nod to sensitive times. She didn't argue. She packed her bag and walked out, straight into a crowd of reporters waiting outside. Their questions came fast, but Emily's response was simple, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart. "He didn't ask for a medal. He just asked for a roof." Her words, captured in a 20-second clip, spread like wildfire, reaching 500,000 views in 2 days. National news picked up the story, one network running a segment titled, "Left Out in the Cold, How One Veteran's Story Shook a City." The title was dramatic, but it carried the truth of Raymond's life, a truth that refused to stay invisible any longer. Raymond Morris, known to most as Rye, found himself at the center of a storm he never sought. His name echoed through the city, on the lips of strangers, in hurried news reports, across the screens of those who'd never met him. Yet Rye himself had vanished from the spotlight. Whispers swirled. Some said he'd headed south to escape the clamor. Others claimed he was holed up with an old friend, and a few even spun tales of the Marines whisking him off to some secretive facility. The truth, as it often was with Rye, was quieter, humbler. He'd simply walked 3 blocks to a weathered bench near a small church, its overhang offering a sliver of shelter. There he sat, as he always had, watching the world churn around him. The attention felt like a weight he hadn't asked to carry. He didn't linger for apologies or crave the gratitude of others. He just existed in that moment, his breath fogging in the cold air, his eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the sidewalk. The sudden fame unsettled him. Rye had spent decades blending into the background, a man whose life was defined not by what he said, but by what he did. The city's gaze felt intrusive, like a spotlight burning through the fog of his solitude. Yet he stayed on that bench, his hands folded in his lap, his weathered jacket pulled tight against the chill. He thought of the years behind him, the dust of distant battlefields, the faces of men he'd saved, the ones he couldn't. The memories didn't haunt him. They simply lived alongside him, quiet companions in a life that had asked for little and given much. People came looking for him. Strangers drawn by the story, journalists hungry for a quote, even a handful of faces from that bitter night at the shelter, folks who'd turned away when he'd needed warmth most. Most stood awkwardly, words failing them. Some offered food, a sandwich, or a steaming coffee, their hands trembling as they extended their gifts. Others lingered at a distance, their silence a mix of reverence and shame. Rye rarely spoke. His presence was enough, a quiet force that seemed to pull truths from those around him without effort. He noticed the guilt in their eyes, the way some couldn't meet his gaze. He didn't judge them. Life, he knew, was hard on everyone in its own way. But when a reporter, notepad in hand, asked what he thought of the Marines showing up, Rye's gaze drifted to the horizon. His voice, rough but steady, carried a single line that would soon ripple far beyond that bench. They didn't come to make noise. They came to remind the world I still matter. That sentence, raw and unpolished, struck a chord. It wasn't just about Rye, it was about every forgotten soul, every person the world had passed by. Soon it was everywhere, scrawled on posters, printed on t-shirts, plastered on bumper stickers. Rye didn't care for the fanfare, but he understood its power. He'd seen men rally around words before, in the heat of battle, in the quiet of loss. If his words could wake the world to someone else's pain, he'd let them carry on without him. 21 years earlier, in the crucible of Fallujah, 2004, the world had been a different kind of chaos. The air was choked with dust and smoke, the heat rising in waves from the asphalt, each step a gamble against an unseen enemy. Raymond Morris, already in his 50s, had been called back as part of a security support contract. He wasn't meant to be on the front lines anymore. No patrols, no rifle in his hands, no dance with death. His role was supposed to be logistical, safe behind the lines, guiding younger men through the maze of war. But on November 8th, the rules of supposed to burned away under the scream of rocket-propelled gleamed. Stationed near a supply checkpoint just outside Route Henry, Rye was overseeing 2 junior teams in a transport convoy when the world erupted. The radio cut to static, and an IED tore through the sand 50 yards ahead, sending a plume of fire and debris into the sky. Gunfire snapped through the narrow alleys, screams crackling over the comms. A 5-man unit, mostly fresh recruits with wide eyes and unsteady hands, was caught in the open, pinned behind a burning Humvee that offered no shelter. Among them was Staff Sergeant Michael Jensen, barely into his 30s, a leader whose sharpness hid a flicker of doubt that only surfaced when the world turned to ash. Jensen's heart was a storm that day. He'd led men before, barked orders with the confidence of youth. But this was different. The gunfire was too close. The the screams too raw. For the first time, fear sank its claws into him. Not the fleeting kind that sharpens the senses, but the kind that locks your legs, clouds your mind, whispers you're not enough. He'd replay that moment for years, wondering what might have happened if Rye hadn't moved. Rye didn't hesitate. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. Years of instinct, honed in the fires of war taking over. Grabbing a rifle, he sprinted across open ground. No cover, no backup, just the pull of a truth he'd learned long ago. You don't leave people behind. His heart thundered, not with fear but with purpose. Mortar fire shook the earth as he reached the Humvee, the second blast tearing through the air, knocking one Marine unconscious and showering them with jagged debris. Rye dragged the kid behind a crumbling wall, his hands steady despite the chaos. Blood pounded in his ears, but his focus never wavered. He turned back for the others, his voice a beacon in the storm, guiding them through the smoke and ruin. They fought their way out, every inch a battle. Shrapnel tore into Rye's leg, another piece grazing his ribs. But he didn't stop. Pain was just noise, drowned out by the faces of the men he was pulling from the fire. When they finally reached for safety, blood seeped through his uniform, staining the sand. He waved off the medics, his eyes scanning the group, counting heads, ensuring no one was left behind. Only then did he let himself breathe. In the medical tent, Jensen sat across from him, his hands still trembling from the fight. The younger man's eyes were hollow, searching for something he couldn't name. "Why'd you come back for us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rye, his face lined with sweat and grime, looked at him for a long moment. His reply was as plain as the desert itself. "Because somebody came back for me once." Those words hit Jensen like a wave, washing away the fog of fear. They weren't just about that day. They were about a life lived for others, a code Rye carried without fanfare. Jensen carried that story through the years, retelling it every Veterans Day, not for glory, not to embellish, but to honor a truth he'd learned in the fire. Survival wasn't about rank or gear. It was about who showed up when the world fell apart. For Rye, the day was just another moment, one he never spoke of again. No medal was pinned to his chest. No headlines heralded his name. The official report dismissed it as a limited engagement with minor casualties. But for the 5 men he'd pulled from the jaws of death, it was a debt etched in their bones. So when Emily Cooper's call reached Jensen, when he heard that Raymond Morris, the man who'd once run through gunfire for his Marines, had been turned away from a shelter in the snow, something inside him broke. The injustice of it burned like a wound, sharper than any he'd taken in battle. He could see Rye in his mind, standing in the cold, his pride too stubborn to beg, his eyes steady despite the betrayal. Jensen didn't hesitate. He made one call, then another, and within 12 hours, 11 more men, some who'd fought beside Rye, others who owed their lives to men like him, were on their way. They didn't ask why. They remembered. Their hearts carried the weight of Fallujah, the echo of a man who'd shown them what it meant to stand tall. For Rye, recognition had never been the goal. It wasn't about plaques or parades, it was about the quiet certainty that he'd done what was right, even when the world hadn't noticed. After the Marines stood outside that shelter, their presence a quiet rebuke to those who'd turned him away, Rye slipped back into the shadows. Some thought he'd returned to the streets, sleeping rough under bridges or in forgotten corners, his solitude a shield against the world's indifference. Others hoped a veterans group had taken him in, offering warmth and the care he'd been denied. Wherever he went, Rye carried the same quiet resolve, his heart steady, his eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. Raymond Morris, or Rye, as his brothers-in-arms once called him, had long since faded into the background of a world that moved too fast to notice. The rumors swirled briefly. Some said he'd been whisked away to a hospital bed, hooked to machines, another forgotten soul. But the truth was less clinical, more human. A group of Marine Corps veterans, their hearts stirred by the quiet injustice of Rye's story, acted swiftly and without fanfare. They found him a place in a private transitional housing facility, tucked away in the hush of the city's outskirts. No press conferences, no grand ceremonies, just a knock on the door, a clean room waiting, and a fellow Marine, his uniform crisp, his voice steady with the kind of respect that doesn't need words to prove itself. "You've carried enough, brother," he said, his gaze locking with Rye's, a silent vow passing between them. "We've got you now." The room they gave him was simple, almost stark, but it was a world away from the streets. A single bed, its sheets tucked tight, offered a kind of rest Rye hadn't known in years. A small television sat in the corner, its screen gathering dust as Rye had little use for the noise of the world. A dresser stood against one wall, empty but ready, and above it, a framed American flag hung, its stars a quiet tribute to the life Rye had lived, the battles he'd fought, the weight he'd carried without complaint. Beside the bed, a pair of new leather boots gleamed, their untouched soles a symbol of possibility, a future yet to be walked. Those first days, Rye was a man of few words, his heart a locked vault. He ate the meals brought to him, slept in the stillness of a room that didn't echo with the city's chaos, and kept to himself, his thoughts a private battlefield. Yet every morning Rye honored the man he'd been. He took his old coat, worn thin by years of cold nights, and folded it with a soldier's precision, laying it gently at the foot of his bed. On top, he placed his dog tag, its faint metallic sheen catching the light, a tether to the brothers he'd lost, the promises he'd kept, the life he'd left behind. It was a ritual of remembrance, a quiet act of defiance against a world that had forgotten him. Weeks passed and the system that had once lost him began to stir. His name was restored in the VA records, a small victory that felt like a reclamation of his identity. Medical care was arranged, his file fast-tracked through the bureaucratic maze that had once left him stranded. On Sundays, a Navy chaplain would visit, not to preach but to sit, to share the weight of silence or the occasional story of the war. Sometimes they spoke of the chaos, the loss, the moments that never left. Most times they didn't need to say anything at all. Their shared presence was enough. The world outside began to take notice, but Rye wanted no part of its spotlight. The mayor's office offered a plaque, a polished gesture of recognition. He declined, his refusal polite but firm. A local news anchor called, eager for an interview, a chance to frame Rye as a hero for the evening news. He never returned the call, uninterested in the fleeting glow of fame. But when a small nonprofit reached out, asking if he'd speak privately to young recruits, not about the glory of service, but the grit, the long shadow it casts, Rye said yes. He stood before them, his voice steady but raw, his words stripped of pretense. He spoke of cold nights that chilled the soul, of names lost to time, of the weight that lingers when the world moves on. Each talk ended the same way, his voice low but unwavering. You're not owed anything when you come home, but that doesn't mean you don't matter. So when you see someone wearing silence, ask their name. Rye began writing letters, not to his own family, but to the families of the men he'd served with, some long gone, others still carrying their own quiet burdens. Each letter began with the same words, I remember. Those two words carried the weight of years, of shared laughter and loss, of moments no one else could understand. One morning as dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and gray, a staff member found Rye on the porch, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. You all right, Mr. Morris? They asked, concern softening their voice. Rye nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. It's not about the shelter, he said after a pause, his words lingering in the cool air. It's about being seen again. That's all most of us ever wanted. By year's end, a new plaque was quietly mounted near the entrance of the Parkside Shelter. Its words were simple but heavy, in honor of Raymond Morris and all those who served without being seen. Rye never went back to see it. He didn't need to. He had a warm bed now, a place to sit in the sun's embrace. When he walked the halls, people met his gaze, not because of a uniform or a title, but because they knew his name. And this time they remembered it. Raymond Morris never sought the spotlight. He didn't hunger for praise or pity, didn't chase the fleeting warmth of recognition. For years, he'd lived in the shadows, not out of necessity, but by choice, carrying his dignity in the quiet spaces where others rarely looked. But silence, he'd learned, could be a heavy thing, and sometimes it needed to be heard. One man, one dog tag, one steadfast refusal to beg for what he'd already earned. That was enough to uncover a truth too often ignored. In this country, even those who gave everything can fade into the background until someone chooses to see them. What the Marines did for Rye wasn't loud or staged. It wasn't about politics or headlines. It was loyalty, pure and unshakable. It was memory, a refusal to let a brother slip away. It was a reminder of what brotherhood means, not just in the heat of battle, but in the Maigamong lonely aftermath, where so many veterans fight alone. And Rye's story wasn't just his own. It belonged to the man sleeping under a bridge 2 blocks away, who also served. To the woman at the bus stop, a folded flag tucked in her closet, its weight heavier than the fabric itself. To the father who never speaks of what he saw, and the son who never thought to ask. Rye's story is not rare, and that's what makes it resonate. If it could happen to a decorated Marine who saved lives without ever asking for thanks, it could happen to anyone. So maybe the question isn't why 12 Marines showed up for Rye. Maybe it's who else we need to show up for. If you're reading this and thinking of someone, a neighbor, a classmate, an old friend you haven't called in years, don't wait. Reach out. Ask their name. Listen to their story, because sometimes the smallest act of recognition can do what no system or speech ever could. Make someone feel human again. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of honor worth standing for, even in the snow.